Welcome to Solosaurus. My name is Brandon Waite, and this is episode 64, where I'm going to be reviewing a game about conquering Europe for Catholicism, Charlemagne, Master of Europe. This episode is going to be just a little bit different because, as you probably noticed, I didn't say Carter's name. Carter didn't chime in here at the beginning of the episode, and that's because he's not here. Carter's wife just had their first child, and so Carter is a dad now. Just became a dad a couple of days ago, so we are very happy for him to be at home with his new baby and taking a break from the show for a little bit. So big congratulations to Carter and his wife. We're super happy for you. That baby is incredibly lucky to have you as his dad. So we are going to go on without him today, and we're going to look at Charlemagne in just a few minutes. But first, we are going to do what we always do and start with the news. Now, I have to tell you, the news this time is coming at kind of a weird time because Gen Con Online has just started. I don't know what the official name for it is, but the COVID-era Gen Con has just started. So there's definitely going to be more big announcements in the next couple of days that just haven't come out yet. But there are already a couple of big ones that I wanted to go ahead and cover here. One of them, I think, actually came out just a few days before Gen Con started, and that is our first news story today, which is that Asmodee Games has announced One Deck Dungeon Abyssal Depths. Now, this is pretty cool because if you're not familiar with One Deck Dungeon, it is a really great small box solo game about delving into a dungeon. All right, you roll a bunch of dice and place those dice on different kind of actions on a little card for each of the enemies and trigger special abilities and items that you've got in order to beat monsters and progress to a boss and hopefully win. It's a tough, fun little game that comes in a small package. I'm not sure why we haven't reviewed it on the show, actually, but it's really good. If you haven't played One Deck Dungeon, it's definitely worth a look, and excellent game. And this is an expansion for it that's going to add fiends. And fiends are like this new kind of enemy type that are going to basically harass you separate from normal enemies, as I understand it, as you progress through the dungeon. It doesn't just make the game harder, though, because if you can beat these things and allocate some of your dice to defeating them, then you're basically going to get some special rewards that will eventually help you in the dungeon. It sounds like a really cool addition to the game, not like a huge expansion based on what I can tell, but definitely something that will add some life to the game. We don't have a release date for this yet or a Kickstarter date or anything like that. I'm assuming it will come to Kickstarter because I think both the original One Deck Dungeon and the standalone sequel Forest of Shadows did, but nevertheless, really cool information either way, even without knowing all the details. So keep your eye open for more information on One Deck Dungeon Abyssal Depths. Our second bit of news today is a new Marvel cooperative game from Fantasy Flight Games called X-Men Mutant Insurrection. Now, this was something that was revealed during the Fantasy Flight In-Flight Report, which is their annual kind of Wednesday evening Gen Con big announcement thing that they do, which this year was plagued by all kinds of live streaming problems. And so they finally got the video out, and when they did, this was, I think, the only real new game announcement in the whole lineup. I found it to be a little underwhelming, personally. It looks like sort of a fast-paced, dice and card-based cooperative game, and nothing about it to me, component-wise, looked particularly special or interesting, and I don't know, it didn't grab me, but I do think a lot of people will be interested in this because X-Men. Now, X-Men have never been my favorite part of the Marvel Universe, but they are for a lot of people, and you get to play as all of the cool X-Men here. You get to fight bad guys, you get to use dice, and frankly, just having something that plays quickly and it has solo play attached to it is going to be a big deal for a lot of people. So if you haven't yet, go to Fantasy Flight's website and you can read up on X-Men Mutant Insurrection, which is coming in Q4 of this year. Our last bit of news for today is something that snuck in right at the end of the Fantasy Flight In-Flight report, and that is a reveal of just a box for something called Descent Legends of the Dark. Folks, I have never played Descent, if I'm just going to be honest with you. I've played Star Wars Imperial Assault, which is basically a Star Wars retheme of Descent, but Descent is probably the most famous modern dungeon crawl game. It is Fantasy Flight's main dungeon crawl, kind of fantasy themed game. Now, they originally had Descent First Edition, which had an expansion come out called The Road to Legend. And The Road to Legend was a campaign. It added a campaign to Descent, which was really cool and kind of revolutionary at the time. Then when Descent 2 came out, it had a campaign kind of built in from the beginning. And Descent 2 was called Journeys in the Dark. So this title, I mean, we know basically nothing about this game, but I'm assuming that this is blending the first and second edition elements in some way. I'm assuming that this is functioning like a third edition because Descent second edition has been kind of dead for a while, I think. And they added solo play to Descent right at the end of the second edition. So I have no details on this except that it comes in a gigantic cube-shaped box that was revealed at the end of the session. I am hoping that this is a full-fledged third edition that has some kind of campaign element to it. And I personally am strongly hoping that it includes an app-driven system. I know a lot of people are not wanting that. So I'm also unselfishly hoping that it comes with some way to control the enemies without an app, just to please everybody. So that's all I know for now. As soon as I learn more about this, I will absolutely be letting you know because I am extremely excited about this. I've always been interested in Descent, but have just held off because solo play wasn't built in from the ground up. I'm really hoping it is this time. And so I feel like the end of the second edition lifespan points us in that direction, but we'll just have to see. So again, that is Descent, Legends of the Dark. Okay, that is all the news we've got for this episode, and so we are just going to jump right into the review, which is brought to us from Stone Valley Games. Folks, if you have not yet shopped at Stone Valley Games, what are you doing? Stone Valley Games is a great online retailer of board games that sells a lot of solo-focused games. They have been great supporters of this show, and I've really appreciated all that they've done for us in providing us with review copies of games and that sort of thing. But at this point, honestly, even if they weren't associated with this show, I would be purchasing all of my games through them because they're just that good. They send stuff quickly. They pack it professionally. They will send you a handwritten note with your order. I'm assuming all the time because everyone I've ever gotten has one, and I know of other people who've gotten them as well. You can earn rewards on your purchases. If you have a family member who is serving overseas as part of the U.S. military, they will ship to that person for free. It's just a really great business. Eric and Wendy, who run the store, are awesome people. They're getting in a ton of new products all the time. So definitely, if you haven't checked out Stone Valley Games, you got to do it. That's where I pre-order all of my Marvel Champions packs, which they announced a bunch more of at Gen Con, by the way. You got to go to Fantasy Flight's website to look that up and then go pre-order them at Stone Valley Games like I did. Really, really awesome stuff. So check that out. That is stonevalleygames.com. All right, folks, time to get to the review, and this time the review is for Charlemagne, Master of Europe. This is a game that comes to us from designer Tom Russell and publisher Hollandspiel Games, and was published in 2017 and plays one player. Now, for those who aren't up on their history, at the age of 29, Charles I became the sole ruler of the Frankish Empire. And what he did with that power over the course of the next 40 plus years was the stuff of legend. His unparalleled achievements in warfare and diplomacy, administration, and culture led to him being nicknamed Carolus Magnus, or Charles the Great, as we know him now, Charlemagne, king of the Franks and of the Lombards, and emperor of the Romans. Now, in this game, you're going to assume the Frankish throne and seek to duplicate or exceed Charlemagne's singular genius, while hopefully avoiding some of his mistakes along the way. So over the course of 12 game turns, you're going to try to expand your empire by beating back rebels and converting pagans, building infrastructure and churches, and expanding your tax base in the process. And if at the end of the game you have beaten the Moors, and you have met the VP threshold, and you have become king of the Lombards, and you've become the Holy Roman Emperor, and you have built 3 bridges and roads regions, you win the game. Whew, that's a lot of things you got to get done. And trust me, it feels like it for the entire game. And we will get to that gameplay stuff in just a minute, but we are going to start with the components for this game. And if you're not familiar with this title, you should know up front that this is I guess you could call it a war game, although I'm probably more inclined to call it a historical game. But it is from Hollandspiel Games, which is a war game publisher. At least that's what I would classify them as. And I think that's important to know going in because if you are primarily a board gamer like I am, wargaming is a kind of a different world. We've talked about war games just a little bit on this show before because we had some requests from listeners that we review a few of them. So we have already reviewed Castle Itter from designer David Thompson and DVG Games, which I feel is a very good entry point for people who are at all interested in war games or just learning about history in a new way, even if you're not fascinated by war itself and the mechanics of war. So I felt like that was a really good entry point. After we did that review, a lot of people said you should really play some stuff from Hollandspiele games. They're very well regarded in the industry. And so I have done quite a bit of war game research at this point, just trying to learn more about this segment of the hobby so that I could try to cover more of that stuff on the show. And one thing that I noticed is that Hollandspiele has kind of a different approach to war games in a number of ways. But one of the ways that is a little more traditional is the components. So if you are a board gamer and you come to this game, I think you're going to be a little confused by what you get in the mail. So Hollandspiele uses a print-on-demand system, which means that they don't print a game, as I understand it, until you order it. That makes their games fairly expensive. It's probably the least efficient way to actually print a game, but when you're a small publisher and you're, printing games that are very niche in terms of like the number of people who are interested in them, it's the way that makes sense for them as a company, which I think is a cool approach to the business model. But you just have to know going in, you're going to end up paying like $50, $60 for some of their games. And what you're going to get in the mail is a very slim box, like probably the thinnest board game box I've ever seen, maybe an inch and a half or something. And inside, all you're going to have is one sheet of counters, which are like square chips that represent different game board pieces that track turns and victory points, as well as like military units and that sort of thing. You're going to get one rule book, and you're going to get one paper map. Now that's going to be a major turnoff for a lot of board game people because you're used to paying $60 and getting some really high quality components. So just go into this understanding this is a different world, right? There are different sets of expectations as far as components are concerned, and that's because there are different challenges that face war game publishers. They're never going to have the super wide appeal in general that you see with more mainstream kinds of games. Even though there are a few designers who have managed to become more mainstream, like David Thompson with the Undaunted Normandy in North Africa, that's just not the norm at all. And those games are much more approachable than some of these. These are more complex games that Hollandspiele's making. So just know all of that going in. Coming at it from that perspective, how do I feel about the components? I'm actually pretty impressed. The paper map thing has always been something that I thought I would never be interested in. I mean, why would I pay $60 for a paper map when I could have a nice, big, thick board? But I gotta say, folks, the map artwork in this is really nice. It's a beautifully drawn map, in my opinion. Everything is very clear on it. And when you lay it on the table, it really kind of pops. Now, I should say you shouldn't play directly on the paper. The folds in the map itself do kind of pucker up the paper a little bit, and they'll make it difficult to keep your counters on there. So what I do, I looked up on the internet how other people manage this, and most folks seem to take a very thin, clear sheet of plastic and put it over top of the map just to keep everything nice and flat. I had an old picture frame that was quite big, like a poster frame, that we weren't using anymore, and I took that out and it was perfect. I took the clear plastic thing out of that and it worked just fine. And honestly, once you've got that on there, it makes for a really nice playing surface. So if you're scared off by that, I would say give it a try. I think you'll like it more than you might think. The other thing that surprised me were the counters. Now, this is not the first war game I played, but it is the first one from Hollandspiele that I've played. And apparently, Hollandspiele does this thing that I've never seen before, which is their counters are printed on wood. They actually print onto a thin sheet of wood and then have the wood pieces laser cut out of it. And so once you punch them out, you have these really like nice, kind of pleasingly thick counters that are, again, made of wood, but nicely printed that you can move around the map. They're a little small, so they can be difficult to stack and that sort of thing, but I really like them. I think they look sharp, and once you've got the map laid out with the plexiglass down and you've got your counters setting up everywhere, it's a really nice looking play experience. I'm happy with the components, but again, you should just go into it with war game expectations, not Asmodee expectations for what you get for $60. And that then leads us to the rules. And again, this is the sort of thing where you're going to want to adjust your expectations a little bit, because I'm used to rule books that have nice, big, colorful examples constantly throughout the book, lots of diagrams and pictures. Wargame rules are almost never organized that way. Personally, the rules are the thing that trip me up the most with respect to the entire kind of war game genre. I don't like them. Just in general, I think that they read like a technical manual, which makes it relatively easy to reference things later on, but it's not great for teaching the game. That said, I think that this is probably one of the better rule sets that I've read for a war game. I feel like everything is pretty clear. It was difficult for me to get a clear picture of how all the mechanics mesh together, but part of that is because the gameplay is so different from anything else I've played before. So I'm just putting that out there. I think that was a lot of my challenge, as I had not played any of the other games with this system, like Agricola Master of Britain, which is like the precursor to this game. And so I had a hard time wrapping my head around the rules. They're only 16 pages long, but each page is just lots and lots of text. I actually had to go online and try to find some videos, and I was thankful that Tom Russell, the designer of this game and person who owns Hollandspiel Games with his wife Mary, has done a couple of short tutorial videos which are very helpful to me. I would have preferred something like Watch It Played style because I'm spoiled and I really, really like that style of video, but there's nothing out there like that that explains the rules comprehensively. So for me, by far the biggest hurdle for this one was getting through the rule book and trying to get all the mechanics in my head. So just know that going in. It is challenging. It's not written like modern game rules. Now, one thing that was helpful to me is at the end of the rule book, there's a few examples of play where you get to see a few turns and what it looks like, and you get a sense for some of the strategy and thought that goes into playing this game. And that was really, really helpful for me. I had nice pictures in there that show you the pieces moving and all that. That was really, really good. But the rest of it, very light on the examples and the pictures. But even though the rules were challenging, I have to say the play for this game is really, really interesting. This is totally unlike anything else I have played before. And so, I can't begin to cover all of the rules in this, nor would I want to, but I want to cover just a few things that I think will give you a sense of how the game plays and what it feels like to play, and give you also a sense of some of the major mechanics. So there are several different phases in any given turn of this game, but the main phase of the game is the campaign phase. That's where you're going to be taking all of your actions. So the board for this game is just a big map of the Frankish Empire, and you're going to have all these little boxes on the map that represent different towns and cities, and they're connected by lines that show you, hey, this region is adjacent to this one, not unlike something like Twilight Struggle, if you've ever seen that map. And all over this map, you have tons of little armies spread out everywhere of all these different people groups that were there in this time, from the pagans who kind of operate on the fringes of the Frankish Empire to all the other little people groups that were among the Franks at the time that Charlemagne had to conquer in order to basically unify a single empire and earn some credibility also with the Pope, which was key to him becoming the Holy Roman Emperor. So what you're going to be doing is you've got all these different people groups spread around that you've got to take care of and suppress in some way so that you can clear them out, so you can start building churches, building infrastructure, and other things that are going to expand your tax base and solidify your power. And your pieces on the board, this is not a normal war game in that sense. You don't have armies that you're dealing with out on the board. This is not a game of troop movement. This is a game of trying to carefully, strategically suppress certain areas, clear them out just long enough for you to work in your infrastructure. And so you really only have two pieces on the board at the beginning of the game. You have Charlemagne himself, and you have one of his marquis, which is like a little lackey that you can send to do your bidding. On your turn, what you're going to do is you're going to be able to act with either Charlemagne or the marquis. Now, there's some actions that only Charlemagne can do, and there's some that both Charlemagne or the Marquis can do, but almost always Charlemagne does the action better. Now, this is interesting to me because you can't be everywhere at once as Charlemagne. You're already stretched pretty thin is the way it feels from the beginning of the game. So you have to rely on your deputies that are out on the board, but you've only got one to start with, and that deputy can't leave the region of the board that it's in. So it's kind of confined to this very small space where it can run around kind of suppressing enemies as they pop up. But it's not like you can have him traveling across the empire to go take care of something while you're on the other end. So what you want to be doing is trying to clear out one region at a time so that you can put down a marquis, and that marquis then can handle doing some of the other things you need to do to win the game. But that is much easier said than done. And so the different actions you can take on your turn are you can move, which is pretty simple. You just move from one point to the next, and that's all it takes. You can put out another marquee on the board, which costs money, which is extremely tight in this game. But if you've got it, it's totally worth it to put out a marquee, because then you've got somebody else who can take actions. You can suppress, which is a way of basically trying to remove units from the board without getting into a full battle. So if there's only 1 or 2 units in a space, you can roll a d8, which I think is cool that that's the dice that this game decides to use. And if you beat the number that's listed on the top chit of whatever pile of enemies are in a given space, then you beat that guy. And if you're fighting them or suppressing them with a marquee, then you can remove just the top chit from that enemy pile. If you're doing it with Charlemagne, you can remove all of the enemies in the pile. So again, that just kind of illustrates how much better it is to take the action with Charlemagne if you can afford to. So suppression is the way that I most often tried to take care of enemies, as long as they're in groups of 1 or 2. But if there are more than 2 units, then you're going to have a full battle. And battles in this game, they're so interesting. Pitched battles are what they're called. They are kind of risky, honestly. You really don't want to be getting into a ton of pitched battles because they can be very costly for you in terms of the number of troops they might take up. But the way the battle system works in this game is you're basically going to have 2 lines of troops in this little box at the corner of the map. And so you're going to line up a bunch of enemy troops. You're going to line up all of your troops that you draw from this pool that's off the board. And each one of your troops is going to have access to 1 or 2 enemy troops that are in front of them. And you get to choose. You're basically going to work your way down your line of troops, one after the next, and you're going to roll a die for each troop to see if they hit the enemy across from them. If they do, they wound them, and once they're wounded, then the next time they take a hit, they're dead. Or certain enemies will be able to kill someone outright, or if you roll an 8, you'll be able to kill someone outright. It's a really interesting idea. It's definitely got more going on than like a simple, let's say, risk kind of system, or honestly, even a lot of the dungeon crawl kind of battle systems that you see, because you're not just like rolling a die and rolling an opponent's defense die and seeing who wins. You do have the added decision of, okay, I have 2 enemy troops in front of me. I want to take out as many of them as I can, because after I've taken my actions, then they're going to get a chance to hit me. And so you want to actually eliminate some of them so that you have fewer people trying to hit you, right? Trying to destroy your troops. And then also, if you can isolate enemies in the battle line, you can flank them. So there's some interesting thought that goes in there. For me, though, the battle system is one of the low points of this game. While it did have some decisions to make, I didn't feel like they were crunchy enough to be interesting, and battles take a while. Each battle takes a little bit to resolve because there's lots of die rolling, lots of moving little pieces in and out of the line. It did not grab me in a way that I would have hoped for a war game. But I thought also that within the grander scheme of the game, it's pretty interesting because, like, again, you really don't want to get involved in those big battles, which is not what you would expect. You really get the feeling that you are a guy who has an empire that's on the verge of becoming something great, but it's not there yet, and your resources are pretty limited. You've got a lot of troops at the beginning, but there's so many enemies on the board to begin with, and so many more that will come on, that you've got to save some for later. And you just don't want to get yourself into a situation where you don't have many troops left, because having troops in reserve will help you to win the game as well. So I do have some mixed feelings on this. I wish that the actual play of it was a little more fun and engaging, but within the overall system, I think it does add something interesting. So you're going to be suppressing and doing big battles from time to time in this game, but then you also have other ways of trying to get enemies to leave. So you can build your roads and you can put down marquees and that sort of thing. You can give people gifts. You can basically bribe leaders to leave the battlefield, which I think is pretty interesting. You can lay siege to an enemy city, which is super risky, because laying siege basically means you're just going to keep rolling die after die after die, trying to beat the leader of a particular city, but you need to be able to exceed it by twice that person's like strength or leadership number. And that is very difficult to do. That could leave you with only like a 1 in 8 chance of being able to beat this guy. The thing is, every single turn that you do this is going to cost you. Bad things are going to happen to you for every die that you roll. But once you start laying siege to a city, you can't stop until it's done. And so that means you can get yourself into a situation where you're rolling 5, 6, 7, 8 times, not getting the roll that you want, and you're paying for it every single time with more enemies coming onto the board, more bad things happening as a result of you taking this action. I love this one. I really do. I mean, there's a lot of randomness bound up in it, but I just think the risk versus reward, the kind of press your luck element of taking this action in the first place is really great because it can help you. I mean, if you win the siege, it can be a big boon to you, but you could get stuck in a loop where you're constantly just rolling dice and have nothing to show for it. So really, really good stuff there. And the last thing that you can do is a forced conversion. This is pretty icky. It's a move that you can only take in pagan regions, and you can do it in any space that has 1 or more units. And you're basically going to take an action, and you will eliminate all units and leaders in the box, plus all units in an adjacent pagan box, which is huge. I mean, there are some of these pagan spaces that can have like 4 enemies in each one. You know, having a battle with them would be very costly. And so what you could do if you're Charlemagne, you go in and I mean, you could take the same action with a marquee, but you're only eliminating all the leaders and pagans from 1 box. If you're doing it with Charlemagne, you can do it from 2 whole cities worth of people. You just remove them from the board. It's a super powerful move, but thematically, what you're doing with your forced conversion is you're either converting people to Christianity and therefore they're no longer a threat to your Catholic empire that you're building, or you're killing them because they won't convert. Either way, you're eliminating all the enemies. It's brutal. I mean, just don't think about it for too long, because if you do, you're not gonna like where it takes you. I think for some people that's gonna be a little too real, probably for them. Maybe not the sort of thing they'd want to be engaged with. I personally thought it was pretty interesting. Not that I think forced conversions are good, because obviously I don't, because I'm a human being. But I do think it's interesting because it has a victory point cost. Basically, you're going to lose a victory point for every unit or leader that you eliminate this way. So you can use it to eliminate 8 enemies and leaders, but you're losing 8 victory points in the process. So, I mean, if you're just doing super well on victory points and you want to burn some of them to take this action, you can. But I was not ever doing well on victory points, so it's hard for me to imagine the person who does this thing. But nevertheless, I thought that was interesting. Now, here's one of my favorite things about this game. All of those actions are like different already than some of the other games I've played. Really, all the other games I've played. Moving and attacking, whatever. That's pretty simple, pretty standard stuff for any kind of game. But the variety of different kinds of attacks here and like bribing people and all that, I found very interesting, both mechanically and thematically. I like that there's so much variety there. But probably my favorite thing about this system is the cup system that it employs. So what really sets this game apart for me is you're going to start the game with 3 cups at the top of the board that have chits in them for enemies and that sort of thing. 1 cup is friendly, 1 cup is unfriendly, and the third is hostile. And over the course of the game, anytime you take an action, you're going to look at this little play area that you've got, and it'll tell you, okay, when you take the suppress action, you need to do a cup adjustment. That's what they call this like main kind of mechanic in the game. You're going to move 1 friendly chit from the friendly cup to the unfriendly cup. And so what these cups represent is how different people feel about your rule and what you're doing. And basically, anytime you do anything on the board, you're going to make people mad, because you're punching into other people's territory and you're killing their soldiers, and you're doing all kinds of things to upset people or make people nervous about what you're doing in the Frankish Empire. So you're constantly moving people from the friendly cup to the unfriendly cup, or from the unfriendly cup to the hostile cup. And occasionally there are a few moves here that will let you move things from unfriendly back to friendly or something like that. But most of the time you're moving the wrong direction. And what's really interesting about that is also associated with each action is something called a hostile reaction. So anytime I suppress, I'm going to move one chit from the friendly cup to the unfriendly cup. And then it says I have to do 2 hostile reactions, which means I take 2 chits out of the hostile cup and I put them on the board. There are more enemy soldiers coming out onto the board. And they're being pulled randomly from that cup, and they could be pulled from any number of different people groups. And what people group they're part of determines where they go on the map. That's a very, very big deal, because what that means is if you're suppressing and you're not suppressing in a way that allows you to beat back more than 2 enemies, then you're actually not making any headway at all on the map. It double incentivizes you basically for taking actions with Charlemagne, who can suppress and clear out all enemies in a space. So even then, though, with like suppression as an example, I mean, you're not eliminating more than 2 units there, and you're putting 2 more out onto the board. So really what this game is about shuffling where the enemies are at any given time. You need to clear out regions with actions like suppression, but then you're going to prompt a hostile reaction, and when you draw chits from the hostile cup, you're just going to hope that there aren't any hostiles in there that are going to go back into the regions you just cleared. That I really, really like for a couple of reasons. Number one is you know what's in each of those cups at the beginning of the game. You have to put X number of red chits in the friendly cup and X number of green chits in there, and you know what the chances are, generally speaking, that you're going to draw a certain type of unit from the hostile cup. So you can plan a little bit before you just get the draw. It's not just totally random. But man, there's a lot of excitement and drama when you draw from that hostile cup. I really, really like that. Now, sometimes it can be frustrating because you can have just cleared a region only to have more people come back in before you can like take any of the actions that require you to have a cleared region. So you really want to be like clearing regions and then putting down a marquee right away who can help suppress anybody else who pops up there. But it can be brutal. It can really hose you. But I don't know. I really like that system, and I like it even more because you can keep taking action after action after action in any given round until you draw 2 in-turn markers from that hostile cup. And that's really interesting to me. You would think that it would be better to have fewer and fewer chits in the hostile cup, right? Because, if there's nobody in there, then there's nobody for you to draw to put out on the map, right? Things are already as bad as they can be. But that means that the fewer chits you have in that cup, then the fewer things there are in there to prevent you from drawing those in-turn chits. It's really good. So basically you can take longer and longer turns the more hostiles are in that cup. It's a fascinating system. I mean, really, really good stuff. It feels innovative. It feels like something that I would like to see done in a non-historical or a war game type game. This is the sort of thing that could probably be implemented in some other like family weight game even, and I would think it was really cool. So really fascinated by that system as a whole. What's also interesting is you pay a lot of attention to that hostile cup and to the cost of all of your actions, because every turn, at the end of each turn, you're going to have to meet certain thresholds in order to continue playing the game, which is also something I've never seen before. At the end of the game, you have to have conquered the Lombards and gotten the crown. You have to have earned enough papal approval to become Holy Roman Emperor. Like all these different things you're working to complete out on the map. But at the end of each individual round, if you don't have if you don't meet the victory point threshold that's printed on the square at the top of the board, you lose, period. So, man, there is a grind for points in this game. You are always under a lot of pressure to get things done. There are 12 rounds in the game. Each one of them can be quite long. And at the end of any given turn, if you haven't met that victory point threshold, you're just going to lose. And I like that because I've never played anything quite like that before. I also like that there are other thresholds you can meet too. So as long as you meet a certain number of military strength, you get a bonus. Like might get some emergency victory points built up, which is like if you ever don't meet the victory point threshold, you can spend emergency VP to make up the difference, which I think is a neat system. I also do think it's pretty grueling. I mean, again, the nice thing is, though, that if you're doing bad enough that you can't meet the VP threshold in round 6, you're probably not going to win the game at the end of round 12. So it does prevent you from playing another hour and a half only to lose the game, right? Because this is quite a long game. My games took me 3 to 4 hours to play. I mean, I'm also a slow player, so yours probably won't take that long, but I don't know. It's a unique system. I appreciate that it maybe saves me some time if I'm not going to win anyway, but whoo, boy, does it put the pressure on you. So really, really like that system overall as well. Now, I think that is most of the game at this point. After you've taken your main actions, you're going to have a chance to build churches, which is an interesting sort of system because, churches are going to increase your tax base. So you're getting more and more money every round, which, I don't love thematically because it just makes me like, ugh, I hate that the church was part of that. But also it's historically accurate, right? And it makes for interesting gameplay because you can't complete a church on the turn that it started. These churches were huge. They took ages to build, and you didn't have modern construction equipment, right? So it takes 2 turns to be able to build these things. And you need a certain number of them on the board so that you can keep generating more money, and because they determine the number of marquees you can have on the board. You cap out the number of marquees you can have until you build more churches. So all that stuff is really, really good. You have a chance to have diplomacy with different nations around you to see how they feel about you and your rule and about how they're going to treat you. I thought that was interesting. The whole thing comes together to become this kind of big, sprawling, epic experience where you are reliving the life of Charlemagne and trying to accomplish all the things that he did, but it doesn't feel simulationist to the extent that it doesn't feel like a game anymore or like it's scripted. To me, it doesn't feel scripted really at all. It's just a really interesting, totally solitaire game that also doesn't have you spending time managing a bunch of stuff for an AI player. It's really like you're drawing things and that determines what you have to beat. There's not an intelligent opponent here. And so, as far as replayability is concerned, I would say that overall it's really good because every game's going to feel radically different as far as what comes out of the different cups and what hostiles come out for the hostile reactions and all that. It's going to feel wildly different because it is so random, right? And that's going to be a drawback for a lot of people, but it does mean there's a lot of variability here. The other thing I would say is I do think the first few turns of the game feels like the best thing to do is to go first for the Crown of Lombard at the beginning of the game, which is one of the 5 in-game goals you've got to meet. But it feels necessary because once you've got it, you generate a victory point every turn, which is a very big deal, right? Especially when you start trying to meet those very difficult VP thresholds. Yeah, it's the sort of thing that I feel like you have to do that at the beginning of every game. But I could be wrong. There could be somebody out there who's played this and no, you're an idiot. You have no idea. You could do all these other things. To me, it feels like that's what you should do first. But otherwise, replayability for this game is very high. That's a little scattered and there's a lot going on here and probably more than we could possibly cover in one review, but that gets you a good sense of where things are and how the game plays. So let's just talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly really quickly as we wrap up this review. Good things, I love that cup system. I think it's really innovative and cool and interesting. I would love to see it done in other games. The components for me are quite good. They are war game good, but I think they're really good. I enjoyed playing with them. I think it has a really nice presentation, and it comes in a super slim box, so it doesn't take up hardly any space on your shelf. Also, I would just say it doesn't feel like anything else I've played. The more I play games, the more I feel like, there's always innovation happening in this hobby, but a lot of games can feel kind of samey after a while. Especially whoever has the most victory points at the end of the game wins, that sort of thing. I think every aspect of this game feels significantly different than anything else I have played before. And then on top of that, the theme is really strong. I think the theme is quite strong. It really makes history come alive for me. Now, I should say that you all may have heard me mention this on the podcast in the past. I am a Christian minister. That's what I am professionally, I guess, or vocationally is probably the better word. When I started seminary to get my grad degree, which is where Carter and I met, I became very interested in church history because I grew up in a Christian tradition that really didn't emphasize it at all. I grew up in a congregationalist tradition, which means we don't have denominational headquarters or anything like that. Each congregation governs itself, and we're really more focused on the scriptures and interpreting the scriptures and less on tradition. And because of that, I didn't have a good, strong knowledge of church history. And when I first encountered it, I was really enthralled by it and really interested. And in fact, I considered pursuing a PhD in church history for a while just because it's so intrinsically bound up with world history, for better and worse, that I just felt like there was a lot of really interesting stuff to cover. And, if I ever got bored with one aspect of it, there's a lot of other history that you could go dive into. But the history of the Middle Ages in particular has always fascinated me. And Charlemagne was such an interesting historical figure to read about. But there's a limitation to how engaging a book about Charlemagne can be, right? There's something to me about playing through his life story that gives you a better sense of just what a complicated figure he was and about how much he did have to accomplish. I mean, you're under so much pressure in this game. I feel like it emulates to some degree the pressure that he must have felt as a person who's trying to expand this empire, trying to gain the approval of the Pope, and trying to, stand on his own 2 feet as a leader, but also knowing that he needed the church in some way in order to endorse him as a leader because the Pope was such a powerful figure at the time. It just really helped me to learn more about this history and to appreciate the life of Charlemagne. And, that's something that for a lot of people isn't going to matter, but for me, it was a big deal. And I think, to me, that is the main value of war games. As games, they're not always as engaging for me as other normal hobby board games. But thematically, they engage me in totally different and really more compelling ways most of the time. And then on top of that, I think that the systems in this game are much, much more interesting than in many war games. I really think Tom Russell, and based on what I've read from other Hollandspiel titles, I really think Hollandspiel is one of the more innovative war game publishers, just from my perspective. So that was a long way of saying I think there's a lot of really good stuff about this game. Now, the bad stuff, there are a couple of things. For me, the rules are just hard. They're just hard to get through, and as somebody who's not a war gamer, I found them quite challenging. I mean, 16 pages is nothing rulebook-wise for me these days, but they were the hardest 16 pages of rules I've probably plowed my way through ever. So, I mean, that was definitely a challenge. I would say I've not played Agricola, Master of Britain, but I think it would be probably a better starting point for this system. It used the same 3-cup system as this, but it's supposed to be significantly shorter, and I think it only has maybe half as many pages of rules, or maybe 12. Anyway, it's definitely a lighter entry point for this system. I would maybe think that would be a better first step than this game, because the rules are definitely a big hurdle to overcome if you're not already a wargamer. The battle system was also kind of a letdown for me. It's not terrible, but it just takes a while to do each battle, and I didn't find it particularly engaging. The last thing is just this game is long and it's hard. This game is brutally difficult. I've not even come close to winning. You can adjust it to make it a little easier. There are options for that in the rules, but honestly, I didn't think it made it that much easier. And the rules also kind of give you, I think it's a very difficult game. And it's long. I mean, it doesn't take that long to set up, and, has a decent, kind of normal table footprint, but you're talking 3 to 4 hours to play this game your first time around. I think you could get it down to 2 or 2.5 probably, but I think the box says 180 minutes on it. It's definitely going to be that at first. You're going to spend a lot of time in the rule book, flipping back and forth, double checking rules, even though they have excellent player aids in this game. Yeah, I think it's going to be a long one for most people. The last thing I would say in the bad category is there is a very, very, very dark side of church history, and one that nobody who is Christian or associated with the church should be proud of. We have done many terrible things over the years, and this game allows you to do those things, which is in some ways, I think that's good and brave of them, because if you're going to cover a period of history and make it even semi-simulationist, I guess, you need to cover the bad parts too. You can't see history through rose-tinted glasses. You got to take it for what it was and learn from it and move forward. And I think, in some sense, it's good empathy building in the sense that it gets you inside the mind of Charlemagne and why he would have done some of the things he did with forced conversions and things like that. But empathy is not the same as affirmation, nor should it be. And I think it will make some people uncomfortable to do the forced conversion thing. That's just my 2 cents. That may not bother you at all, but just something I wanted to throw out there. Overall, though, I don't think there's anything ugly about this game. It's a really, really good game, a really interesting game, and it's one that I don't think I can give it the stamp of approval, simply because I don't think I love this particular entry. I think that some of the other titles in this series, like Agricola, Master of Britain, or there's a new title coming out, and I can't remember the name of it, that's basically supposed to be in between difficulty-wise Agricola and Charlemagne, like difficulty and game length wise. But I think this one is just a little too long and a little too difficult for me personally. It's not the sort of thing I would be able to get to the table very often. But if that barrier was removed, I don't know. I mean, I really want to play Agricola Master of Britain now because I think it could be a stomp of approval game for me, because obviously it's worth picking up only for solo play. It only plays solo, and it's a very compelling solo game in so many ways. I just think the complexity for me needs to be turned down a little bit for me to actually enjoy and really, really love the game. But even though it's not going to get the stomp of approval from me, I definitely think you should check this out. It's a super interesting game and probably unlike anything else you have played before. So if you haven't already, you really need to check out Charlemagne, Master of Europe. And you do need to know you can only get this from Hollandspiel's website. So definitely go on there and check that out. Otherwise, I would normally direct you to Stone Valley Games. And you should still go to Stone Valley Games and buy, other games. But this one you can only get from them. And many thanks to them for sending me a review copy. All right, folks, that's all we've got for this episode. If you haven't yet, check out the other shows in the Dice Tower Network. You can find out more information about those on Dicetower.com. We are a part of that network and very proud to be. And there are plenty of other shows about board games in the network that you can go and check out. You can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram. There's a great way to follow what we're doing, see what games we're playing, see what's coming down the review pipeline. So check that out if you haven't already. Also, you can go on to iTunes and rate or review the show. That really helps us out, helps us to rise in the search results when somebody's looking for a solo board games podcast. And if you haven't yet, you can go on to Board Game Geek, send me a message, ask for 8 Geek Gold, and I will send you that so that you can get yourself a Solosaurus micro badge. We have our own cool little yellow and purple dinosaur that you can get for your profile. And if you don't have the 8 Geek Gold you need, I'm more than happy to spot you that so you can get one for yourself. All right, folks, that's going to do it for this episode. Until next time, my name is Brandon Waite. I really miss Carter Mackey, and this is Solosaurus.